kind of add-on to Marxist theory, because it does talk about all these things. Now, I think this is actually a distortion of what Marx and Engels wrote about. Kate's given a whole number of examples, just a couple of examples to add to that, that Marx himself, interestingly, although both Marx and Engels looked on working class women as by far the most oppressed and exploited and in a very, very miserable situation, they thought that all women were oppressed. And actually Marx at different times in his life took up cases. One was a very famous case among the aristocracy, the Bulwer-Lytton divorce case, which I won't go into detail about. It's like something out of sort of Wilkie Collins' novel or something. It's absolutely horrific sort of thing. But Marx was very, very concerned about what this showed, about how even rich, comfortable women were treated in a society in which they were oppressed. And the way in which, you know, you have to look at these whole questions. He also took up a whole number of, he was very interested in a study of French suicides, of women who committed suicide, and he traced that back in a number of cases to sexual abuse and rape within the family. So I just think it's worth looking at, you know, that they had a very, that wasn't most of what he did, it's not true to say it was the majority of his life's work, but they were concerned about these kind of, these kinds of questions in a very, very concrete way. So I think it's worth just thinking about that. And of course, as Kate has said, in The Origin of the Family, which is the book that Engels wrote in the 1880s, but he says, he starts it off by saying, the preface to the first edition, the following chapters are in a sense the execution of a bequest. No less a man than Karl Marx, and Marx had died, a year before this, had planned to present the result of Morgan's researches. Morgan was the anthropologist who did all the studying of this. Anyway, he goes on about this. So he saw this as kind of carrying out Marx's work in the same way that he saw it, dealing with volumes 2 and 3 of Capital as being continuing Marx's work. And of course, this very famous quotation, which is much debated and much controversial about what they say about the family, is in this little preface to the first preface to The Origin of the Family. According to the materialistic conception, the determining factor in history is, in the final instance, the production and reproduction of immediate life. So immediately you've got this kind of sense. We're not just talking about how people produce goods and produce their livelihoods. We're also talking about how they reproduce themselves and how they maintain the family and what different sorts of forms of family again. This, again, is of a twofold character. On the one side, the production of the means of subsistence. On the other side, the production of human beings themselves. The social institutions under which people of a particular historical epoch and a particular country live are conditioned by both kinds of production, by the stage of development of labour on the one hand and of the family on the other. So, you know, I just think that we have to start from an assumption that this was something which was of major concern. However, they also say, or Engels writes in this, that actually the more in which society develops, the more that production develops, the more that production tends to dominate the form of the family and how people live and how they reproduce. So that he says that by the time society is developed as it was by the time that he was writing, that you're talking about a society in which the family structure is completely dominated by the property structure. In other words, it becomes something which is subordinate to it. Now, I wanted to read all that out because I think this whole question is obviously one of the biggest questions for socialists and feminists and for people who care about these questions of women's oppression. But really this question of what's the relationship between paid work on the one hand and unpaid domestic labour on the other hand is one that I think is absolutely central to what we do. And I think when we look at what the basis of women's oppression is, I don't think you can say that you can separate it from women's role in the family and women's role in reproduction. Now, people always say, well, some people don't have children, some people have gone through their menopause, so they can't have children, some people, you know, etc., etc. Of course, there are many exceptions to this. There's people who decide they don't want to have children, who can't biologically have children, all sorts of different questions. But the crucial question is it's this system which dominates the whole of the female sex. It's not something which you can really escape from, even if you decide that you're going to live in an alternate way and actually, interestingly, even if you look at lesbian and gay relationships, which were once regarded as completely sort of outside of the norm, now there's an acceptance with civil partnerships, with gay and lesbian marriage and so on, that these are themselves integrated into this family form, and even adoption of children by lesbians and gays and so on. You know, this is a complete turnaround in the last 30 or 40 years. Now, this question of the relationship between paid and unpaid labour was something that really was a major issue in women's liberation politics in this country in the 1970s in particular. It was a situation where people really, you know, people had a view of the working class. And of course, the working class, even in the 1970s, was very different from how it is now in terms of women's labour. You still talked very much about housewives as well as about people who went out to work. Not all women, but a very substantial number of women either didn't work and worked full-time in the home, or they worked part-time, and that they saw themselves, and most other people saw them as mainly mainly involved in domestic labour, and that was their role. The idea of the family wage, that the man would be the breadwinner, would have enough money to be able to keep the woman and 2.4 children or whatever it was in a fairly decent lifestyle, was one that was really accepted. And what the early women's liberation, and particularly for Marxist and Socialist feminists, and lots of men, actually, Marxist economists within this tried to do, was to try to find a way of sort of fitting domestic labour into, you know, economically into this question of what does it do for society. Well, I mean, at one level, it's completely, absolutely bloody obvious what it does for society, because it does actually reproduce the next generation. Anyone who's been in any way involved in this process knows what an absolutely massive task it is, a thankless task a lot of the time, and one which most people aren't paid to do. And as Kate has said, even when you are paid to do it, the fact that you have this huge army of people who aren't paid to do it means that your wages are pushed right down to the bottom. They're just a bit higher than if you didn't get any at all. That's the way that it kind of works. But people tried to find this, you know, there had to be some sort of economic way in which you could explain this, which, you know, was, in my opinion, was a good thing to try to do, even though there was some sort of absurdity with various bits of it, and there were great arguments which went on. Very, very fierce arguments, actually, over domestic labour, which now seem positively, you know, bizarre, really, when you kind of look at them. But what it was about was saying, do women in the home count as part of the labour force, which was the argument of the wages for housework people, that they had to be counted as exactly the same, and that therefore labour in the home should be paid a wage in the same way that labour in a factory would be paid a wage. Did housework produce value? I mean, this was a huge question, you know, for Marx, this whole question of, do you produce surplus value? Do you produce commodities which have an exchange value? In other words, you can sell them on the market for something. And probably most people concluded that actually housework doesn't produce exchange values or surplus value. What it does produce is use values. If you have, you know, if you produce a meal and feed your children, that is, you're doing something very useful, even though you can't sell it to anybody else. And the same with a whole range of domestic jobs. The problem with it was, I think that it had this kind of analytical separation of the domestic sphere and the work sphere, which I think is ultimately quite a damaging separation, partly because most people, most working class people anyway, do some housework. I mean, men do less housework than women, but actually do considerably more than they did in the 70s, and do some. So everybody is spending some of their supposed leisure time doing some kind of domestic labour, and that's so I think there's this kind of analytical separation which isn't helpful. I also think if you just say that housework produces use values, it doesn't really kind of get you very far, because, you know, all right, you produce a use value, so what, really? It's not. It doesn't really tell you whether this is something which is essential to capitalism or whether it's something which is kind of marginal to capitalism. And certainly my argument that I've always put is that I think that argument on its own, this is just about use values and then exchange values are produced and surplus value is produced somewhere else. I think actually underplays the role of domestic labour in the production of commodities. Because if you actually look at this, I would argue that housework does produce use values and it doesn't produce commodities by and large, except with one absolutely glaringly huge exception, which is the production of labour power. And that the unpaid labour in the home has a massively important role in doing this, in socialising, in feeding, in caring for the existing generation of workers, but also, most importantly, because capital is always looking for young, replenishing, sort of bloodsucker in this kind of way. It's always looking for young people who can work harder and faster and quicker than older people can. And it plays an absolutely essential role in that. And therefore, I would argue that the reproduction of labour power within the home, social reproduction, actually indirectly contributes to the production of surplus value. It doesn't directly contribute to it, but without that workforce which is socialised and which is ready to work and which is relatively healthy and educated and all the other things which the state contributes to, but actually individual families contribute to on a massive scale, is something which is absolutely essential to capitalism, and therefore you can see it really very much at the heart of capitalism, even if it doesn't have a directly productive role in that sense. So that's one argument which is important. The other argument, which I think is important, is the way in which the family changes over time in terms of the work that is done in the family and the work that is done outside of the family and brought into the family in the form of commodities. And what you actually find is that Marx, because Marx, was obviously very, very clever by most people's standards, was a genius, as Engels called him, but also had a fantastic way of foreseeing. He was writing at a time when actually most of what he writes about certainly hadn't been proved or hadn't been, and wasn't really common in most parts of the world. But he had a great way of foreseeing this, and he says, that the amount of necessary labour carried out in the home, what you have to do in the home, that actually prevents you, it diminishes the amount of wage labour which is available outside of the home. In other words, if you're stuck looking after children all day, you're not going to be able to work in the factory. You don't, therefore, yourself produce surplus value. You're not, therefore, making a profit to the capitalist. How do you begin to change that? Well, of course, there's a drive to commodify domestic tasks. And Marx is so good on this. When he wrote Capital, the first volume of Capital, which was published in 1867, so he was writing this, in the early 60s, 1860s probably. He says domestic work such as sewing and mending must be replaced by the purchase of ready-made articles, which by and large weren't there then. There weren't sewing machines in the 1860s. That was a later invention, let alone all the things that we take for granted today. They must be replaced by the purchase of ready-made articles. Hence, the diminished expenditure of labour in the house is accompanied by an increased expenditure of money outside. What does this mean? It means that the family becomes this unit of reproduction of labour power, which it still is, but also a massive unit of consumption. We're all in the season of goodwill and ridiculous consumption. And this is the extreme form of it, but it's something that we know is carried out all year. Now, just to sort of rush through the rest of it, because I've slightly gone. Oh, okay. All right, I don't have to rush through, but don't say that. Okay, I'll be another 5 minutes, or maybe 8, or something like that. Okay. Yeah, let me just have a look. All right. So I think when you look at it today, you have to say these two elements to it. It's not productive of other goods in a way that the family used to be for most of history, where agricultural goods or textiles or all these sorts of things were produced in the family. That's kind of gone. I'm not saying there aren't the odd people who do produce these things in the home, but by and large that's gone. So it's there to reproduce the existing and, more importantly, the next generations, and as a centre of consumption. I would add another little point here, which, we talk about housework. I would say, and I have to say this isn't my thought, it's the thought of an American socialist feminist called Barbara Ehrenreich, who's written some very interesting books on different aspects of women's work. And she says, actually, only working class women now do housework. That middle and upper class women buy practically all of this. And I was looking the other day at wage levels for different groups of women workers. And it's an interesting thing that if you're a university lecturer, your average wage is 39,000, which isn't huge, actually. It's quite, it kind of shows most university lecturers are at the bottom of the scale rather than higher up. If you're a domestic, if you're working as a maid or a servant, a cleaner in a home, you will be earning on average 10,000, which I think is probably a massive exaggeration because lots of people get paid in cash in hand and so on. Now, if you're a university lecturer, you're earning 4 times as much as somebody who does that. And it's these low wages. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with anybody earning £39,000. I do think there's something wrong with anybody earning £10,000 in this society. But it's that low wage economy which has driven a lot of this, the rise in domestic servants and domestic employees. And that's a very, very big thing which it's worth just bearing in mind. Now, in terms of the current social reproduction theory, which is mostly, it's mostly based on a book by a woman called Lisa Vogel, who wrote a book called Marxism and Women's Oppression back in 1983, which is a book I think is well worth people reading. It's a theoretical book which deals with, as it says, Marxism and women's oppression, and makes a number of points that you might or might not agree with, but it analyses things. She tries to analyse things as a kind of totality as opposed to seeing capitalism and patriarchy as separate things, and I think she's absolutely right about that. And she tries to talk about social reproduction in this kind of way. So I think it's well worth looking at, and it contains many of the same sort of insights that you get in the domestic labour debate. But I would say there are also some problems with it, and particularly, as I said at the beginning, this idea that Marxism has never dealt with this question is just not true. I mean, Communist Manifesto, Marx says that the worker is exploited by the capitalist at work, but also by the landlord, by the, you know, the shopkeeper, by the pawnbroker. We could add dozens and dozens of extra categories here in the 21st century. But, you know, so I don't think that's right. It also has a very abstract view of the reproduction of labour power. You know, it says, well, labour power doesn't have to be produced just in the family, it can be reproduced through slavery or through immigration or anything. Now, I think this begs a huge question, which is actually migrants have families, and somewhere they're being reproduced in the Philippines at very little cost to anybody here, and much, much cheaper than they would be here. But nonetheless, there is still a family which is reproducing them. To a certain extent, that's also true of slavery. They also talk about prisons and orphanages and all these kind of things. Now, I don't think any of those things can be seen as some kind of alternative to the family. I think there are instances where the state intervenes directly in order to care for children, although they're cared for so appallingly, these things, or to lock people up when they supposedly have done something wrong. But I don't think that you can say there is just an abstract way of reproducing labour power which is outside of the family, and therefore to me the family still remains, whatever its imperfections, very central to this whole question. Now, just to conclude, in terms of women's liberation and socialism today, I think women are part of production outside of the home in the way that they haven't been ever historically, or certainly the only comparable time was during the Industrial Revolution in this country, or during wartime, particularly the Second World War, are the only ones. But also the role in reproduction is still key. There is, you can argue why this is, whether it's ideological, whether it's economic, and I think it's a combination of these different things. You know, they have insurance policies sometimes where they say, what would it cost to insure the tasks that a wife carries out? And it adds up to £800 or £1,000 a week. Well, not surprisingly, when you think, you know, in other words, there is no way that capitalism is going to pay for these kind of services as a substitute for the family. And of course, the family has the addition that it's ideologically is part of the cement of capitalist society. It transmits many of the ideas of capitalist society, including consumption being the route to happiness and so on. Very, very important in these sorts of things. And it's reinforced by the state. I think it's very important that we do try to have this kind of materialist analysis of women's oppression, because I think one of the problems, I haven't talked about identity politics because it's not, this is about a different kind of topic, but I think this idea of identity politics as we've seen it over the last 2 or 3 decades, which is it's all about individual oppression, which can be dealt with individually. This is a systemic oppressive system, an exploitative system, and we have to see it in those terms, and therefore we have to have a materialist understanding of exactly where women's oppression comes from in order to be able to fight to overcome it.